Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us for our presentation today, which is the growing challenges of aging in place. This is presented by Avenidas Village, and your host today is going to be Chuck Sieloff. Chuck has been in the Palo Alto area since 1965 when he came to get his PhD at Stanford. He has worked in the IT industry at Hewlett Packard for 30 years and has now, since retiring 20 years ago, been involved with a number of nonprofit organizations, one of which is Avenidas Village. He currently serves as the co-chair for our advisory council. So thanks for joining us, and go ahead and let's get started with the session.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Well, it's great to see so many people interested in this subject. The phrase aging in place wasn't really even familiar to me until I got involved with Avenidas Village 4 or 5 years ago. And just to avoid any possible confusion, Avenidas Village is not a place to live. It's a voluntary or virtual community of people who are living in their own homes. So let's just get right into it. And first, we'll start off with a little bit of historical context. The U.S. is about 2/3 of the way through a really dramatic demographic shift in the demographic profile of the country. Today, we have about 46 million seniors over 65, and we get another 10,000 plus every day turning 65. By 2030, when the last of the baby boomers reach 65, there'll be about 64 million of us. And by 2050, that'll be up to about 90 million. And that means that at that point, we will be about 22% of the total population, compared with only 8% in 1950. This is kind of a standard way of looking at age profiles in a population. And you can see some two dramatically different pictures from 1960 and 2060. Let me just point out, that these bars represent 5-year increments of age. And so you see, for example, here, the reduced birth rates of the Depression and the Second World War. You see also the beginnings of the baby boom coming in right in here. And of course, the dramatic difference between the two is how rapidly this tapers off. So not that many people lived into their 70s or 80s in 1960. The right-hand chart shows the projection for where this will be in 2060. And, it's good news. We're living a lot longer. We're having fewer children. And so that's all to the good, but it is a really dramatic change. And just to, you can obviously see the difference in the upper age ranges where a tremendously increased number of people are surviving and living well into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then just to point out one comparison here, this right-hand chart represents more than twice the population of the left-hand chart. And yet when you look at the 0 to 4-year-olds here as an age bracket, you see it's almost identical. So almost the same number of children, but almost 2.5 times the population in 2060. So this is a major change. It affects almost every aspect of society. This is another way of looking at it. We're rapidly approaching the crossover point where there will be more older adults than children for the first time in our history. We are right now right about here. And you can see how rapidly that gap is closing and how quickly it will continue on that trend until the senior population is significantly greater than the population of children. So that raises lots of implications. It affects almost every aspect of society. One of the dramatic things is what's called the dependency ratio. The ratio of workers to retirees is going to shift dramatically. When Social Security was first introduced, there were about 8 workers for every recipient of Social Security. Now that number is down to about 3. And by 2060, it'll be about 2.5 workers per retiree. So that has major implications for the financial viability of various government programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. It also affects there's a tremendous delay now in intergenerational transfers of wealth because people are living much longer. And, in the US, we rely pretty heavily on immigration to replenish our labor supply. If you contrast that with other countries like most of Europe or most dramatically Japan, Japan is already at a dependency ratio of just 2 to 1 and is headed towards a ratio of 1.2 to 1. So a point where there's almost as many retirees as there are active workers. There are, implications for voting power, that when the senior population grows to be 22% from previously 8%, that's a significant shift in voting power. But the area that I want to really focus on, what we're going to talk about most in this presentation, is where and how are these older adults going to live? So there is a kind of an official government definition for aging in place. The ability to live in one's own home and community. And that's an important qualifier there. So we're talking not only about the residence, but the neighborhood, the community that you're in. To live in one's own home and community safely, independently, and comfortably, regardless of age, income, or ability level. So that's kind of the official aging in place definition. And, according to AARP survey, about 90% of seniors want to stay in their own residence as long as possible. And some 80% think that they're already in that residence, that their current residence is where they're gonna stay as they age. That all sounds fairly simple. It just means we keep doing what we're doing. If you've been living in your own home for the last 20 or 30 years, you just keep on that path. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. This is an organization you probably didn't even know existed, the National Aging in Place Council, and they do a lot of data collection and data analysis around this issue of aging in place. And they've identified these 5 areas as particular challenges associated with aging in place. And we're going to take a look at each of those 5 areas in more detail. So the first one is the house itself, the house that 90% of us are hoping to stay in. 90% of us may think we're going to stay in that house, but Census Bureau figures show that only 10% of those homes meet the minimum requirements for elderly living. Now, I know, some of you are probably thinking, what do you mean? I've been living in my own home for the last 30 years. What's the issue? What's the problem? The problem is that we're looking not at the requirements of the last 20 or 30 years that you've lived in that home, but we're looking ahead to the next 10, 20, or 30 years and what kind of accommodations will be required as you age in that home. So when they talk about minimum requirements for elderly living, they're talking about things like a step-free entryway, a bedroom and full bathroom on the first floor, bathroom accessibility features like grab bars. So there's a list of these kinds of things that are considered minimum requirements. And some people may have higher minimum requirements than other people, depending on their health conditions. So, a lot of people will be facing some degree of retrofitting of their home. Some of those are pretty simple, fall prevention, putting in grab bars, getting rid of loose throw rugs, things like that. That's relatively cheap to do. You can accomplish most of that kind of thing by under $1,000. When you get into more extensive work, like widening entryways, providing better accessibility to facilities in the home, better access to the use of home features, you could be talking tens of thousands of dollars to retrofit your home. And then in some cases, particularly if you're in a multi-story home with stairs, if you need to do extensive modifications for bathroom accessibility, things like that, you're talking about some pretty substantial costs for getting the house that you're hoping to stay in up to the standards that are considered essential. So the next category, health and wellness. This was actually a kind of a surprising statistic for me. The government stats estimate that 90% of older adults experience one or more chronic conditions that require some kind of specific treatment or medical care. Not that they're disabled, not that they're unable to take care of themselves or live independently, but they require attention. They require healthcare attention. And 60% have two or more of those conditions. And these are just some of the main conditions that they're talking about here, the main contributors to health issues and to shortened lifespans. And the other major risk factor is injuries. So, every year, 1 out of 3 older adults will take a fall. Less than half of those get reported, but nevertheless, it's a major risk, and you can, in a way, you can just be one fall away from a serious change in your ability to stay in your own home and take care of yourself independently. Personal finance. In this case, individual circumstances vary tremendously, and I can't really get into a lot of detail about individual situations, but there are a few generalizations we can make. One of the sobering ones to me is that half of older adults in the country have essentially no retirement savings at all. They're basically counting on Social Security, perhaps counting on a pension from their career. But basically no reserve of significant savings to get them through their older years. Those who do have savings, they average around $200,000 or $300,000, but then 12% of seniors have over $1 million put away. So this varies all over the map in terms of how well prepared you are financially. But I think one thing that is pretty universal is what I call this need for longevity planning. And by that, I'm just simply saying you don't want to outlive your resources. And so you need to plan on how to avoid that kind of problem of outliving your resources. I think one useful strategy is to start planning for different scenarios. Many of us, I think, when we first set up our estate plans, our wills, our inheritance plans, things like that, kind of have a kind of a vanilla scenario in mind where if you're a married couple, you just continue living together. When one spouse dies, the other spouse takes over and takes over the aspects of planning that the other spouse was doing. You probably plan on dividing your assets equally between your children. And so, that's kind of the vanilla plan that many of us put in place probably during middle age. But as we get older, I think we have to start getting more realistic about the possible scenarios that exist. So, what's going to happen if one spouse outlives the other spouse by 10 years, 20 years? What's going to happen if one spouse starts to have cognitive problems and is no longer in a position to take over the financial planning or financial decision making that the other spouse used to do? What's going to happen if your kids don't agree about treatment options, about inheritance situations, if their financial situations are very different? So as we get closer to these plans becoming reality, we really need to start thinking about some very different scenarios that could come about, and is your plan robust enough to handle those different scenarios that could conceivably come around? Another factor I think is that you need to kind of hedge your bets against changes. You may have been making assumptions about various government programs, things like IRA funds as retirement funds and as inheritance funds, estate tax exemption. Those are all things that are subject to some pretty rapid changes if the government changes its mind, or if some of those stresses we talked about earlier with the changing demographics require significant changes in the way inheritances and tax laws are set up. So, just in the last couple of years, inherited IRAs have changed dramatically. They're no longer nearly as attractive as they were just a few years ago as an inheritance vehicle. Estate tax exemption, in recent years has gone the other direction. It used to be very restrictive when I did my first estate tax plan. The exemption was $600,000 and the tax rate was 55%. Now it's $11.7 million per person with a tax rate of 40%. So dramatic change. And yet, if Congress does nothing, which they tend to be good at, that exemption will be cut in half in just a few years. And if some of the proposals currently on the table are actually implemented, the exemption could be reduced significantly, so that things like IRAs, which looked like a very advantageous way to save, if they put you over some future exemption limit, you could wind up not only getting taxed at 40 or 50% estate tax, but also the distributions from those IRAs would be taxed as regular income. So, there's some serious planning implications to some of these changes. And then, I think that as we get older, there are some unconventional alternatives that we didn't necessarily think about when we were younger that need to be taken into consideration, particularly around the longevity planning concept. So, there are things like reverse mortgages, home equity lines of credit, annuities. Many of you may have a life insurance policy that you no longer need, that the things you were insuring against have already gotten past the phase when it would be a problem. And so, something like 500,000 seniors a year just abandon their life insurance policy because they no longer feel it's needed. And yet, you can sell that life insurance policy. You can get, so all of these unconventional alternatives are ways of turning assets into income that you might not think about in the normal course of things. And then finally, if you live in your own Bay Area home, you really need to think about how you're going to use what is probably your biggest single asset. So if you've been in that home for 20, 30 years or more, the value of that home has skyrocketed beyond anything you probably imagined when you first bought it. And the capital gains liability that you have if you sell that home has also skyrocketed and could go even higher if that tax rate is increased. On the other hand, you have the Prop 13 locked in low property tax, which is a major protection for aging in place, but also a kind of a disincentive for selling your home. And then California has a kind of an unusual advantage in that as a community property state. When the first spouse dies, the cost basis of that house, the entire cost basis of the house, is stepped up to the current market value. So all that capital gains liability is erased at that point. In most other states where it's not community property, only half of that value would go through the cost step up. So that's a major thing to think about when you're doing financial planning. It, of course, is also one of the things that's on the table as a possible change as the government looks for increasing sources of revenue to fund some of the social programs that it's trying to implement. So, the financial planning aspect is something that you need to review periodically, and in particular, to be realistic about what your future situation is likely to be and the range of possibilities that future situation might take. So the next area of concern, transportation. There are like 41 million senior licensed drivers. A lot of those seniors have issues with vision, with hearing, with slower reflexes that increase the risks. And yet, for many, many of us, driving is really equal to independence. It's probably one of the hardest single decisions, whether you make that decision yourself or whether someone else makes that decision for you. But giving up the ability to drive yourself is really a significant change, and one that needs to be planned for. It has gotten a little easier with the ride share services that are available now. There are convenient alternatives to driving yourself. One of the side benefits of the pandemic and its reliance on Zoom for remote access is that reduces the need to drive every place to participate in events. So that has gotten a little easier. And this is an area where moving into a condensed retirement community can drastically reduce the need to drive. And often those communities even provide transportation services to outside events. So it can be a major consideration in whether or not you are able to stay in your own home. I know in the case of Avenidas Village, we're trying to support people staying in their own home, and one of the key benefits is a transportation benefit for people who are at that stage where they no longer are comfortable driving, and they can get a transportation assistance in going to and from events that we sponsor, and subsidized rides for other personal errands and trips. So then the final thing, the fifth area of concern is often overlooked. It's social engagement. And it may not be obvious, but studies have shown that social engagement is one of the best predictors. It's probably the best predictor of how successful your aging condition will be. More of a predictor even than your financial situation, than your home situation, than many of your health considerations. So social engagement is very important, and it's been shown in numerous studies that social isolation and loneliness are major health risk factors. In fact, there's a phrase in some of these studies that loneliness kills. Loneliness can increase the risk of premature death by up to 50%. And they've even made attempts to sort of compare the risk of social isolation with other risks. And it's comparable to things like high blood pressure and obesity and alcoholism. One study I saw equated it to smoking 15 cigarettes a day as a health hazard if you're socially isolated. When we talk about social engagement, it's more than just a tight inner circle of family and a few friends. That kind of tight inner circle can actually limit some of the broader connections. And so social engagement really is more about joining outside groups with shared interests, activities that you can participate in, and those kinds of things. Joining those kinds of groups can reduce the risk of future depression by about 25%. So we've been looking at some fairly sobering statistics and numbers, and I would imagine that some of you are probably thinking, well, thank goodness that doesn't apply to me. But I think the key thing here is that we're not looking backwards at how you got to this point. We're looking at the path ahead, at the path forward for the next 10 or 20 years. And if you think about that path forward, you may not currently be subject to some of these concerns that we've talked about, but the odds on you avoiding all of these factors as you look ahead are pretty small. And this is an area where, to be frank, denial is not a strategy. You really need to think about how you're going to deal with some of these things. The Wall Street Journal did a special section, a special feature on the lasting impact of the pandemic. So it gives us kind of an idea of what to look forward to in this period we're going through now. One of the things out of that study was how shockingly inadequate, to quote this study, how shockingly inadequate our care infrastructure and systems are. It was also suggesting that we may need to revise our thinking about age segregated housing arrangements, which in the view of many people has not really prepared us very well for living longer lives. We are seeing some changing priorities. I think we are likely to see more resources, more government resources and funding to help people age at home. Particularly community-based programs. So things around transportation, things around home health care, making sure that home health care is accessible and affordable to everyone. So those things, we are seeing proposals already at both the federal and state levels to address some of those problems, but we have a long way to go. The other thing is that I think we will find things getting a little bit easier because of new technologies. Telemedicine, the pandemic was really a major breakthrough event for the adoption of telemedicine. In the first 5 months of the pandemic, Medicare reported 12.1 million visits using telemedicine. And Stanford Healthcare, even though they've been open now for some time, back to in-person appointments, they're still finding that 30 to 40% of their delivery services are done virtually through telemedicine. So that looks like a change that is going to stick with us and is going to make a significant impact on the affordability and accessibility of certain kinds of medical care. We're also, we're seeing a proliferation of wearable devices that can monitor all different aspects of our health. My watch, if I make a sudden movement of my arm, my watch keeps asking me if I've had a fall and do I need to contact someone. The devices are monitoring various, blood pressure and things like that can sound warnings if you're approaching some threshold, some dangerous threshold. So I think those wearable devices will increase in importance for sure. And then, we already talked a little bit about Zoom opening up new opportunities for social interaction. I know, again, just using my experience at Avenidas Village, that we shifted a tremendous amount of our social interaction to Zoom. And after a little bit of a familiarization period and some simple training, that has turned out to be very effective and has actually increased participation in a lot of the activities that we have. So let's look at some of the alternatives that we face looking forward. One alternative that I would guess all of you are well aware of are the age segregated housing, continuing care retirement communities. You're aware of these probably because this is a big business. There's lots of marketing associated with these facilities. There are about 2,000 of these CCRCs around the country, serving 600,000 people. I was surprised to find out that 80% of those are nonprofit organizations. But they only serve about 2% of the over 70 years old. So it's really not clear that it's a scalable solution. And recent trends have been, at least in our area, towards a much more costly kind of resort hotel model of these communities, which will put it out of the range of what many people are willing or able to afford as an alternative. Previous generations, they often relied on multi-generational homes, taking grandma or grandpa into the home of the adult children, having them perhaps help with childcare and things like that. This was a pretty common approach for earlier generations. And partly this was cultural. Some cultures really valued and felt an obligation to take care of the older generation. Partly it was also demographic. It's one thing to take in one grandparent who may live, 4 or 5 years beyond 65. It's a very different thing if you have, 3 or 4 of those grandparents and they can live for another 20 years. So, the idea of multi-generational homes is not as obvious as it was for prior generations when that segment of the population was much, much smaller. Nevertheless, we did see some increase during the pandemic of people buying homes as multi-generational residences. There are even some major home building companies that have standard plans for multi-generational homes, for a sort of a separate wing for a different generation. So this could be making a comeback, and we'll see. If the assisted living kinds of alternatives continue to be less attractive, the multi-generational home could wind up playing a more prominent role than it has recently. There are a couple of other less well-known alternatives. One of these started really in Europe a couple of decades ago, and it's what's called a senior co-housing community. So it's a situation where a few dozen families, a few dozen households will have private living quarters, but will share major facilities like kitchen facilities, exercise facilities, maybe even a dining room, that kind of thing. And so it's a way of providing some economical housing alternatives without people giving up their independence. We don't have a lot of these in this country. Mountain View, for example, does have one that apparently has been successful and is usually has a wait list to get into. There are a couple hundred of these around the US in some 38 different states. But again, these tend to be smaller scale. They tend to be they tend to be providing housing for a few dozen households rather than thousands of households. So, how big a part this will play is unclear. There are other possible alternatives. I read about one that sounded kind of interesting, where a commercial venture would rent apartments in standard apartment complexes, but those apartments would then be rented out to seniors. And the commercial venture would provide an extra layer of services for the seniors moving into those apartments. So help moving in and out, arranging for healthcare, possibly arranging for meal deliveries, making modifications necessary to support aging. So this was an intriguing example because it took advantage of existing housing stock, but by adding an extra layer of services, made it an attractive alternative for seniors who were looking for continuing in at least a semi-independent way. I'm not aware of anything like this in California, but if it catches on, if it's commercially successful, we may well see more of that. And then, finally, one that I'm most familiar with is this village model, which may not be that familiar to all of you, but it has been identified, in various state plans and starting in federal plans as a leading best practice for, healthy and vibrant aging, for people to stay connected to their communities with reduced isolation, increased independence, and enhanced purpose of life. So the village model is one that I hope everyone will become aware of. This started really as a grassroots organization outside of Boston more than 20 years ago. And it was just, a neighborhood of older adults that wanted to stay in their homes and felt like by combining resources, by helping each other out, by supporting each other, they could make that alternative much more easy and safer to continue. That caught on. And so these so-called villages, there are now over 300 of them nationwide. Avenidas Village was the first one on the West Coast, started in 2007. And we were fortunate to be able to do that under the sponsorship of the Avenidas Senior Center. So unlike a lot of these villages around the country, we actually have access to a very nice facility in downtown Palo Alto, and we have a full-time staff, 2.5 people who support the organization, and about 300 members. So, you know, this is a local example of one of these villages. There are 10 or 15 of these around the Bay Area, depending on how you define Bay Area, and about 40 in California. This village concept has been endorsed by the governor's master plan for aging as a key strategy, in particular for this notion of helping people stay in their neighborhoods, in their communities. There is also a national network of these villages. They don't share any governance. They don't coordinate in any formal way, but this network does share best practices and information. They have a website. They have newsletter. They have an annual conference where villages can get together and compare notes. And then this National Aging in Place Council that I mentioned earlier is also a good source of data and analysis, helpful kinds of checklists and things that can help you determine, like, for example, what kinds of modifications do I need to make to my house? Am I in a position to consider staying in my home? That kind of thing. So anyhow, that's the village movement. I guess, you know, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope that you will take this one message away, that if you expect to continue living in your own home, then at some point, you know, that needs to become a proactive strategy. And so, you know, basically the question is, what's your plan for aging in place? And I'll just leave you with one kind of final thought. According to that National Aging in Place Council, most older adults will spend more time planning their next vacation than they will making aging in place a sustainable option going forward. So, you know, it's a matter of prioritizing. It's a matter of planning. It's a matter of thinking ahead, thinking for the future. So this is my contact information. You know, if you want to follow up on anything, get in touch with me through my email address. The Avenidas Village organization also has a public web page that you can get a lot more information from. So basically, you know, feel free to follow up on this, and let's open it up for questions then. So Erica, you want to come on screen?
I'm coming. Hello. Yeah, so I have a few questions that came in during the session that we'll start with, and then anybody else, please feel free to add your questions in as we go. The first question is, please address how we begin to address home modifications to age in place. Do we start with a contractor, an architect, or something like that?
Yeah, you know, I think finding a contractor that kind of specializes in this kind of thing would be probably a good starting point. I think this National Aging in Place Council that I mentioned has a website, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think one of their publications that you can download is a whole analysis of the kinds of modifications that would need to be made depending on your particular circumstances. So that can become kind of a checklist, and then you can try to find contractors that have, you know, that have done this kind of work before. In our case, I mean, one of the advantages of an organization like Avenidas Village is that many of our members have already been through this process. And so that's a resource that we can tap into, and we can ask other members, who did you work with? How did that work out? We have a directory of service providers like that, and reviews of members who have used those. So, if you can find that kind of resource, that makes the search a lot easier, and you can have a lot more confidence in the results.
Okay, thank you. Another question was from Carol. She asks, I'm curious about the statement that age segregated housing arrangements have not prepared us well for living longer lives. Why? Is it a social aspect of intergenerational interactions? Is it a physical situation? She's looking for more detail about that.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is the, uh, the benefits of living in a multi-generational community, and the aspects of staying in your neighborhood, in a familiar neighborhood that has a multi-generational mix. I think that generally is considered a healthier environment. It's not to say that the CCRC is not well suited for some situations. I mean, you may well reach a stage in your life where that's the right answer, and they certainly provide a wide range of services. But at least as presently configured, it's not widely affordable for a large segment of the population, and it's probably not very scalable. And I think the pandemic was a real setback for some of those facilities, that people who were envisioning the sort of the resort community kind of model suddenly couldn't leave their rooms and had their meals delivered at the door, and all those common facilities that were so attractive were closed. And so I think under those circumstances now, that's temporary, hopefully, and won't come back again, but I think it did change the way people perceived the attractiveness of that environment.
Okay, next question is, what opportunities exist locally to help seniors with social isolation?
Well, I'm not sure if you mean as a volunteer. There are certainly things that you could do from a volunteer point of view to help with that. Avenidas itself, the village obviously has a lot of activities that are aimed at that, and would welcome volunteer assistance for some of those things. But Avenidas also, the larger organization, serves a much larger community. Our village community is just 300 members, but Avenidas serves thousands of Mid-Peninsula seniors with a wide variety of services, and all kinds of ways to get involved in those kinds of things.
Thank you. Let's see, what other questions? We're having some, okay, here's one. Do you have an example here in the peninsula where someone has bought a bunch of apartments and rented them to seniors as a group?
No, I mentioned that I'm not aware of any local examples of that. The example that I read about, and it sounded like it was kind of a pioneering example, it was kind of almost an experiment in this economic model, was in Florida. And Florida, of course, has a real density of senior population, and a lot of apartment complexes. So it may work better in that kind of an environment than, for example, in the Mid-Peninsula, where it might be tougher to pull something like that off. But if it's successful, then I think you could assume that that other businesses will jump on board and try to provide that kind of thing.
Okay, in the chat, I had a question that I need to introduce myself, which I failed to do earlier. I am I'm just here to help out. Actually, I am the director of Avenidas Village, so I work very closely with Chuck and the other chair. I basically carry out as much as possible the desires of the members as they develop the village program, and I'm here to support them.
And Erica's role is one of the things that really differentiates our village model from a lot of the villages who don't have that kind of resource. And also, you know, behind me in my virtual background is the Avenidas facility in Palo Alto, which also provides space for us and event spaces and things like that. So, you know, that's a part of what we have to offer.
And another question about resources, any community resources to help homebound seniors suffering social isolation?
Well, you know, I guess it would depend on what is causing the isolation. You know, if you're in reasonably good health and independent, then there are lots of things that you can do to get involved with senior activities, either through Avenidas or through Avenidas Village or things like that. If you have more need for care services, you know, for example, Avenidas Village, not Avenidas Village, Avenidas has an adult daycare center in Mountain View that provides services for people who really need assistance through the day, whether that's for cognitive reasons or physical reasons. And so those kinds of facilities do exist. And their Avenidas itself, and Erica, you probably know more about this than I do, but Avenidas itself is probably a good source of information about those kinds of services and facilities.
Yes, exactly. I would say visit the Avenidas website, which is www.avenidas.org. And it has the listing of all kinds of different programs and the ways that their community center has tried to develop in-home kinds of opportunities to socialize through their classes. And also, as you mentioned, the Rose Kleiner Center. Here is another question for you, which is actually very common that we run into a lot. My mother does not make friends easily anymore, nor does she care to. How do we gently push her to
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. I think that what we find, the adult children of seniors are often the people who really encourage their parents to join something like Avenidas Village as a way of creating a social context. And you know, it takes a lot of the burden. You know, it requires less initiative on the part of the individual person because there are so many activities going on and so many ways to get involved that, especially with the encouragement of adult children, you know, it really provides a kind of a ready-made framework for a much higher level of social engagement. And I think that's one of the main things that we find with the village. And we often hear that from adult children, that's, you know, one of the, they feel much better to have their parents involved in an active community like that, where it doesn't depend on the individual taking a lot of personal initiative to figure out things to do.
Okay, and final question, and I can answer this one. What is the organization in Mountain View that provides a seniors co-housing community? The name is actually Mountain View Co-Housing Community, I believe.
I think that's right. Yeah, if you Google that, I think you'll find it.
And I did put the website in the chat, so you'll have to scroll up a little bit to see it, or no, it's in the questions, I'm sorry. And let me just make sure I have the right information for you. But yes, it's Mountain View Co-Housing Community, and they do have their own website, and it is mountainviewcohousing.org.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's an intriguing possibility. I mentioned that it's not very scalable. These kinds of facilities need to be designed, for this purpose. So, it's not easy to just kind of convert an apartment building into a co-housing facility. So I think it hasn't really caught fire in terms of being readily available, but it's an interesting model to keep an eye on for sure.
Okay, we still have a few questions coming in. The next one is, how do you find reliable in-home care and what is the cost typically?
Boy, I can't tell you the cost because it ranges so widely, depending on what kinds of services are required and depending on your insurance, whether you have long-term care insurance, things like that. So that the cost I really wouldn't even try to address. There are agencies. Sometimes home care is provided by sort of individual contractors, individual people. But there are agencies that provide a wide range of home care services, everything from just kind of companionship and household help and transportation, all the way to fairly serious medical assistance in the home. But working with an agency gives you the advantage of being able to access a range of these services and to not be dependent on one individual kind of not showing up one day or something like that. So you can find those again. Avenidas probably has a list of those kinds of agencies. Avenidas Village certainly has relationships with a couple of those agencies that our members use, and you could get member recommendations if you were a member of the village.
Okay, I have another question from somebody out of the area, and I'm going to go ahead and answer that, and I'm also typing my answer for them. I am from Missouri. Where or how do I find out if there is a village movement in Missouri? So my answer to you is visit the Village to Village Network, which is www.vtvnetwork.org. And at that website, you can actually enter your location and see what villages are nearby.
Yes, yeah, they make it very easy to locate villages, and actually the headquarters of that Village to Village Network is in St. Louis, Missouri. So yeah.
And let me see if there are any other questions that need immediate answers. We're getting a lot of thank yous, and I think that most of the general questions are done. So thank you everyone for being with us. There's still a few questions that have come in about Avenidas Village specifically, and so I will follow up with you individually when you've answered that. To answer those. So any further questions you have, go ahead and type them in now. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and finish up the session.
Yeah, and if you are interested in finding out more about Avenidas Village, this was not intended as a kind of a sales pitch for Avenidas Village, but if you would like to find out more information, we do have small group kind of coffee chats where we're talking much more detail about what membership in the village involves, and so you can go to our public website and sign up for those coffee chats.
Okay.
And Erica, I hope we can hang on to the chats because I haven't had a chance to review those, so
Yes.
I think you can save those afterwards.
Yeah, we'll save that. People are asking for how to contact us directly. Please use my email, which is ethomas@avenidas.org. And I'm going to put that in the chat. Any other questions that you have, you can email to me. So let me just put that in right now. And feel free to send me an email at any time and we will follow up with your additional questions. ethomas at avenidas.org. Okay, thanks everybody, and we will save these questions and follow up with anybody that we can.
And thank you for your attention. I hope it was helpful to many of you. Thanks.
Thanks again.